Richard's voice was cold and sharp, reverberating in the grand hall of the family estate. "You should never have been part of this family," he spat, glaring at Laura with a mixture of disdain and pain. His words hung heavy in the air, filled with the bitterness of loss and anger. Laura stood firm, though inside, her heart was breaking. She had loved Michael, his son, truly and deeply. But now, facing Richard's wrath, it seemed like that love was not only erased but rewritten as a betrayal. "You were responsible. If you hadn't been so reckless, Michael would still be here," Richard continued, his voice rising, shaking with emotion. He paced back and forth in front of her, his expensive shoes echoing on the marble floor. Laura clenched her fists, fighting back tears. "It was an accident, Richard," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I would never have." "Accident?" Richard interrupted, his face twisted in fury. "An accident that took my only son? Your carelessness destroyed this family, and now you're going to pay the price." Without giving her a chance to respond, Richard turned to the butler, who had been standing silently by the door. "Pack their things," he ordered. "I want them out by tonight." Laura's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at her children, Emily and Ethan, who stood quietly by her side, their wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. They were too young to understand fully, but they could feel the tension in the room. Richard's gaze softened briefly as it fell on them, but the anger soon returned. He couldn't look at them without seeing Michael. "No," Laura whispered, shaking her head. "You can't do this." Richard's eyes blazed with anger. "Watch me." The butler hesitated, glancing between Richard and Laura, but after a sharp nod from Richard he left the room. Laura's heart raced. This couldn't be happening. Everything she had left of Michael, her home, her security, was being ripped away. But there was no mercy in Richard's eyes, no room for negotiation. As the night fell, Laura, Emily, and Ethan found themselves standing outside the estate, a few hastily packed bags by their feet. The estate, once a symbol of security and family, now felt like a distant dream. The gates closed behind them with a cold finality, shutting them out from the life they had known. They stood in the cold, unsure of what to do next. Emily clung to her mother's hand, while Ethan stood quietly, his small face trying to hide the tears welling up in his eyes. Laura looked down at her children, her heart breaking. She had no idea where they would go, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't afford to break down now. For their sake, she had to stay strong. Laura found herself in a dingy motel later that night, the small, cramped room a far cry from the spacious, elegant halls of the estate. The twins slept fitfully, the emotional toll of the day evident in their restless movements. Laura sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall. She felt numb. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? How had she gone from being a part of one of the most powerful families in the city to sitting in a cheap motel with no idea what tomorrow would bring? But there was no time to wallow in despair. She had to think of her children. Emily and Ethan were everything now, and she had to find a way to provide for them. She couldn't let Richard's anger dictate the rest of their lives. Over the next few weeks, reality hit hard. The savings she had managed to take with her were dwindling fast. Laura struggled to find work, her former life of luxury ill-preparing her for the harshness of the world outside the estate's walls. Doors that once opened for her because of her connection to the Carlyle name were now slammed shut. The world was cruel to those who fell from grace. The children, too, struggled with the sudden change. Emily missed her toys, her room, her friends. Ethan, always quieter, seemed to withdraw even further, sensing his mother's distress but not understanding how to help. They asked about their grandfather, why he was so angry, why they couldn't go home. Laura had no answers, at least none that would make sense to a child. But amidst the heartbreak and uncertainty, Laura refused to give up. She spent her days searching for work, knocking on doors, sending out resumes, swallowing her pride and accepting whatever she could find. Every rejection stung, but each failure only strengthened her resolve. She had to keep going. For them. The twins began to adapt in their own way. Without the trappings of wealth, They found joy in simpler things: a trip to the park, a makeshift fort made from old sheets in their small apartment, bedtime stories by the flickering light of a lamp. Laura marveled at their resilience, even as she worried about what the future held. Then, one day, a small opportunity came. It wasn't much, a part-time job at a local bakery, far from the glamorous life she had once known, but it was a start. Laura took it without hesitation, grateful for anything that could help put food on the table. The work was hard, long hours on her feet, and the pay barely enough to cover the essentials. But as the days turned into weeks, Laura found a strange sense of peace in the routine. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was something. There were still moments of doubt, times when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. Nights when she lay awake, wondering if she had made the right choices, if she had failed Michael, if she was failing her children. But in those moments, she would look at Emily and Ethan, their small faces peaceful in sleep, and remind herself why she had to keep going. The children, too, began to thrive in their new reality. Emily made friends at her new school, and Ethan, though quieter, found solace in books and drawing. They didn't have the luxuries they once did, but they had each other, and in many ways, that was more valuable than anything money could buy. As the months passed, Laura slowly began to rebuild their lives. She found small victories in everyday moments: a promotion at the bakery, enough money saved for a proper Christmas for the twins, a growing sense of independence and strength. The world outside the estate wasn't as frightening as it had seemed at first. It was tough, unforgiving at times, but it was also real. And Laura found herself appreciating the honesty of it, the way it forced her to fight for what mattered most. And then came a breakthrough she hadn't expected. A friend of hers from her old life, someone she hadn't heard from in months, reached out with a proposition. It wasn't charity, but rather an offer of collaboration, an idea for a small business venture that could help Laura regain some of her financial footing. Laura hesitated at first, wary of stepping back into a world that had so thoroughly rejected her. But the opportunity was too good to pass up. With a mixture of fear and excitement, Laura took the plunge. She invested what little savings she had left and threw herself into the new venture with the same determination that had carried her through the worst of times. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of setbacks along the way, but slowly, things began to change. For the first time in what felt like forever, Laura felt like she was in control of her own destiny. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was building something new, something better for her and her children. Richard Carlyle was still out there, and his hatred hadn't faded. But Laura no longer feared him. She had faced the worst he could throw at her, and she had come out stronger. The life they were building now was theirs, and nothing, not Richard, not the past, not the tragedy that had taken Michael from them, could take that away. Laura stood in the doorway of their small apartment one evening, watching Emily and Ethan play on the floor, their laughter filling the room. She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't the life she had expected, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Laura knew she had no choice but to forge ahead. With her small savings and the connections she had built from her past life, she started a business in a niche market, designing and selling handcrafted jewelry. It wasn't easy, and the early days were full of uncertainty, but her determination was relentless. She poured her energy into the business, learning everything she could about running a company, managing finances, and marketing her products. Slowly, her hard work began to pay off. Orders trickled in, then surged, as word of her unique designs spread. What began as a desperate attempt to provide for her children evolved into a legitimate business that gave her purpose and pride. Emily and Ethan watched their mother with admiration, and in their own ways, they supported her. Emily, always studious, focused on her academic pursuits with a newfound drive. Inspired by her mother's perseverance, she decided to pursue a career in law. Ethan, more reserved but equally determined, developed an interest in finance, devouring books on investment strategies and economics. Though they had been thrust into a difficult situation, they had learned resilience from Laura, and it began to shape their futures. The days of struggle seemed far behind them as Laura's business grew steadily. She expanded her operations, hired employees, and began selling her products in boutique stores across the country. The long hours and sleepless nights were paying off. Every new milestone brought a sense of accomplishment that surpassed anything she had felt in her former life of wealth. She had built something from the ground up, and it was hers, something that no one, not even Richard Carlyle, could take away. Emily thrived in law school, quickly rising to the top of her class. Her sharp mind and passion for justice made her a standout, and she earned a prestigious internship at a top law firm. Ethan, with his talent for numbers and strategy, had secured a role at a successful investment firm even before finishing his degree. He was quickly proving himself to be a prodigy in the financial world, impressing his colleagues with his insight and instincts. But as they reached new heights of personal and professional success, the shadow of Richard Carlyle loomed large. None of them had forgotten the cruelty of their expulsion, the way he had ripped their lives apart without a second thought. The desire for revenge simmered quietly beneath their achievements, a constant reminder that their success would never feel complete until they had confronted him. They knew they couldn't just move on, they needed closure, and in their minds closure meant retribution. Laura, Emily, and Ethan began to discuss their options. They knew that going after Richard directly wouldn't work. He was too powerful, too well protected in his world of wealth and influence. They needed a plan, something that would allow them to strike at him without exposing themselves to the same vulnerabilities they had once suffered. As they strategized, the idea of adopting new identities emerged. They would re-enter Richard's world, not as the broken family he had thrown out, but as powerful individuals who could play his game on their terms. The plan took shape. Laura, now a successful businesswoman, would use her connections in the fashion world to get close to Richard's inner circle. Emily's growing legal expertise and network would allow her to infiltrate Carlyle's corporate dealings, while Ethan's financial acumen would give them the tools to dismantle Richard's empire from within. They worked meticulously, each of them using their unique skills to build a web of influence that would eventually tighten around Richard. They gathered information on his business dealings, his financial holdings, and his personal connections. Ethan spent nights poring over corporate reports and financial documents, identifying weak points in Carlyle's vast empire. Emily, now working with some of the most powerful people in the legal world, used her position to quietly probe into Carlyle's legal vulnerabilities. And Laura, with her growing reputation in the luxury market, positioned herself as someone who could potentially partner with some of the Carlyle family's business interests. As the plan evolved, they all felt the emotional weight of what they were doing. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming their lives and ensuring that Richard could never hurt them again. But there were moments when doubt crept in. Laura sometimes questioned whether this was the right path. She had built a life she was proud of, and her children were thriving. Was it worth risking everything to bring Richard down? Emily, too, wrestled with her conscience. As a future lawyer, she had sworn to uphold the law, and yet here she was, plotting the downfall of a man through covert means. But every time she thought about what Richard had done to her family, she remembered the fear and helplessness she had felt as a child, and the fire inside her reignited. She was not the scared little girl she had once been. She had the power to fight back, and she intended to use it. Ethan was the most pragmatic of them all. To him, this wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. He believed that Richard's power and influence had allowed him to escape accountability for too long. Taking him down wasn't just personal, it was necessary. Ethan's calm, strategic mind guided their actions, ensuring that every move they made was calculated and precise. The closer they got to their goal, the more tension built between them. Each of them felt the burden of what they were about to do, and it weighed heavily on their relationships with one another. Laura, in particular, struggled with the idea of dragging her children into something so dangerous. She had spent years trying to protect them, and now, it seemed like she was leading them into a war. But Emily and Ethan were adults now, capable of making their own choices, and they were as committed to the plan as she was. Finally, the day came when they were ready to make their move. Laura had secured a meeting with one of Richard's key business partners, a man who held significant sway over the Carlyle family's investments. The plan was simple: infiltrate his world, gain his trust, and then use that leverage to destabilize Richard's position. Emily and Ethan, working in the shadows, continued to gather intelligence and prepare for the moment when they could strike. It was a delicate balancing act. One wrong move, and everything they had built could come crashing down. But they were prepared. They had planned for every contingency, every possible outcome. They were ready to confront the man who had once destroyed their lives. Laura, now dressed in designer clothes and exuding the confidence of a successful entrepreneur, walked into the meeting with her head held high. This was her moment. The power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer the vulnerable woman Richard had cast out of his estate. She was someone who could command respect, someone who could hold her own in his world. As the meeting progressed, Laura found herself slipping effortlessly into the role she had crafted. Her years of struggle and hard-earned success had given her a strength and resilience that Richard had never anticipated. She was no longer playing by his rules, she had her own. Meanwhile, Emily and Ethan continued to work behind the scenes, each of them contributing to the larger plan in their own way. They knew that this wasn't just about destroying Richard, it was about ensuring that he could never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt them. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. For Laura, Emily, and Ethan, this was more than revenge. It was their chance to reclaim their power, to rewrite the narrative of their lives on their own terms. They had risen from the ashes of their former existence, transformed into something stronger, sharper, and more capable than they had ever been before. Now, it was time to face the man who had tried to break them, and show him just how wrong he had been. Laura, Emily, and Ethan returned to the Carlisle estate with a purpose, but they did so as different people. Their transformation was complete. Each of them had carefully crafted a new identity. Laura now appeared as a wealthy, confident investor in the luxury market. Emily, a sharp, successful lawyer, and Ethan, a financial genius, played their parts as her powerful children, well versed in the world of high society. Their arrival was met with curiosity, but their wealth and charm quickly opened doors. Even Richard, with all his suspicion and guarded nature, didn't recognize them. To him, they were just another set of influential figures vying for a place in his circle. Richard had remarried since their departure. His new wife, a younger woman named Sabrina, was eager to establish herself in the elite world. Laura and her children were invited to the exclusive parties, dinners, and events hosted by the Carlyles, seamlessly integrating into their social world. With every interaction, they gathered more information, studying Richard's movements, his business dealings, and his personal connections. They played the part of admirers, subtly flattering him, gaining his trust while secretly dissecting every aspect of his life. As time passed, Laura's confidence grew. She had feared the moment she would stand face to face with Richard again, but the man who had once terrified her now seemed vulnerable. She saw the cracks in his armor, the subtle unease he tried to hide. Emily and Ethan, too, sensed his growing insecurity. Behind their smiles and polite conversations, they worked tirelessly to gather evidence of his corruption. Emily, with her legal expertise, began digging into Carlyle's business records, using her access to the legal world to uncover inconsistencies. She found deals that didn't add up, contracts that were signed under questionable circumstances. Ethan focused on the financial side, discovering that Richard's empire wasn't as stable as it appeared. His investments were built on risky ventures, and his wealth, while vast, was more precarious than anyone knew. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. Richard's entire empire was laced with deceit and corruption, hidden under layers of lies. But there was something else that gnawed at them. The more they looked into Richard's past, the more they realized that Michael's death, the incident that had triggered their expulsion, was shrouded in mystery. There were inconsistencies in the reports, gaps in the story that didn't make sense. Emily and Ethan began to suspect that Richard had orchestrated more than just their exile. They dug deeper, uncovering documents, old emails, and communications that suggested Richard had been involved in something much darker. Emily found the breakthrough, an old correspondence between Richard and a private investigator hired to follow Michael in the months leading up to his death. The investigator had reported Michael's growing discontent with his father's business practices, hinting that Michael had discovered some damning information. The night of the accident, Michael had planned to confront Richard. But instead of a resolution, there had been a crash, a tragedy that conveniently removed Michael from the equation. Ethan found evidence that tied Richard to a series of fraudulent investments, some of which had been covered up by buying out officials and manipulating financial reports. The image of Richard as a self-made, respectable businessman began to crumble. Piece by piece, they built a case against him, gathering proof of his crimes, fraud, manipulation, and even indirect involvement in Michael's death. The mounting evidence weighed heavily on Richard. His usually unshakable confidence began to falter. He sensed that someone was closing in on him, though he couldn't pinpoint who. His paranoia grew as whispers about his questionable business dealings began to surface in his social circles. Laura and her children watched as Richard became more irritable, more defensive, his grip on his empire slipping. The pressure was building, and they knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. As their investigation reached its peak, Laura, Emily, and Ethan made their final move. They carefully planned a public event where they could reveal the full extent of Richard's wrongdoings. It was to be a gala, a grand affair where the most influential figures in business, politics, and society would gather. The perfect stage for the fall of a man who had built his entire life on power and reputation. The night of the gala, Laura stood at the entrance, welcoming guests with a calm confidence. Richard, oblivious to what was coming, mingled with his peers, unaware that his downfall was imminent. Emily and Ethan moved through the crowd, finalizing the details of their plan. Everything was set. They had gathered the evidence, prepared the presentations, and now, it was time to strike. As the evening progressed, Laura took the stage, ostensibly to announce a new partnership with one of Richard's business ventures. The room fell silent as she began to speak, her voice steady, filled with an underlying tension. But instead of discussing business, she shifted the conversation. Slowly, deliberately, she began to reveal the truth. She spoke of deceit, of corruption, of how one man had built his empire on the backs of lies and manipulation. She presented the evidence they had gathered, each piece meticulously laid out for the world to see. Emily, now standing beside her, took over, explaining the legal ramifications of Richard's actions, how he had defrauded investors, manipulated markets, and covered up his involvement in Michael's death. Ethan followed, presenting the financial documents that proved Richard's empire was on the brink of collapse, propped up by illegal dealings and fabricated reports. The crowd was stunned. Richard stood frozen, his face pale as the weight of the revelations hit him. His reputation, his legacy, everything he had worked for, was being dismantled in front of his eyes. He tried to speak, to defend himself, but the evidence was overwhelming. There was no way out. As Laura delivered the final blow, revealing Richard's involvement in Michael's death, the room erupted. Reporters, who had been invited under the guise of a business announcement, rushed forward, capturing every moment. The scandal was immediate. Richard's allies distanced themselves, his business partners severed ties, and his carefully constructed world began to collapse. For Laura, Emily, and Ethan, the moment was bittersweet. They had exposed Richard for what he truly was, but it had come at a cost. The years of struggle, of pain, and of planning had brought them to this point, but the victory felt heavy. They had destroyed the man who had once destroyed them, but in doing so, they had also confronted the darkest parts of themselves. As the night came to a close, Richard, defeated and disgraced, left the gala in silence. His empire was in ruins, his reputation beyond repair. Laura, Emily, and Ethan had won, but it wasn't the kind of victory they had imagined. It was necessary, it was just, but it wasn't sweet. The next day, the headlines were everywhere. Richard Carlyle, once the most powerful man in the city, had fallen from grace. His business empire was under investigation, his personal fortune in jeopardy, and his name forever tainted by scandal. Laura and her children, now free from his shadow, could finally move on. Their lives had been defined by their exile, by the years of struggle and pain that followed. But now, with Richard's downfall, they could close that chapter and begin a new one not defined by revenge or retribution, but by the strength they had gained along the way. The night of the charity event arrived, a glitzy affair attended by the most powerful figures in business and politics. The room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of polite conversation. But for Laura, Emily, and Ethan, it was the culmination of years of planning, struggle, and quiet determination. Their confrontation with Richard was imminent. They had rehearsed the moment in their minds 1,000 times, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of facing him in such a public arena. Richard, as always, held court among the elite, unaware of what was coming. He moved through the crowd with ease, his practiced charm still intact despite the growing rumors swirling around his name. His confidence, however, was a facade. The tension in his movements, the nervous glances he cast toward the media in attendance, betrayed his unease. The cracks in his empire were starting to show, and tonight, Laura and her children would bring it all crashing down. Laura made her move first, approaching Richard with an air of calm authority. She introduced herself under her new identity, speaking with the assurance of someone who belonged in this world. Richard barely registered the interaction until he saw Emily and Ethan flanking her. The shock on his face was immediate, a flash of recognition he couldn't hide. For a moment he froze, his carefully crafted persona slipping. Laura's eyes met his, and in that silent exchange, years of pain, betrayal, and anger passed between them. Emily wasted no time. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the room, drawing the attention of the nearby guests. She laid out the facts, the evidence of fraud, corruption, and the truth about Michael's death. Ethan followed, presenting the financial documents that revealed Richard's deceit. The room fell silent as the weight of their words settled over the crowd. Journalists scrambled to capture every detail, cameras flashing as Richard's carefully constructed world unraveled in front of him. Richard tried to speak, to deny the accusations, but his words faltered. The truth was irrefutable. The guests, once his allies, began to distance themselves. The murmurs grew louder, and the tension in the room became palpable. Richard's composure shattered. He lashed out, accusing Laura and her children of fabricating lies, but the evidence was there, undeniable and damning. His rage only confirmed what everyone in the room had begun to suspect, that the man they once revered was nothing more than a fraud. The moment reached its peak as Laura delivered the final blow. Calm and composed, she revealed Richard's involvement in Michael's death. The gasps from the crowd were audible, the scandal now undeniable. Richard stood exposed, not just as a corrupt businessman, but as a man who had destroyed his own son to protect his empire. The fallout was immediate. Security escorted Richard from the event as reporters descended, eager for statements. In one evening, his reputation, his power, and his wealth crumbled before the eyes of those who once idolized him. In the days that followed, the consequences of Richard's downfall played out on the front pages of every newspaper. His company was hit with lawsuits, his assets frozen as investigations into his fraudulent dealings began. Former allies distanced themselves, eager to avoid being dragged down with him. His wife, Sabrina, left him, taking what little remained of their joint fortune. The man who had once commanded fear and respect was now a pariah, his empire in ruins. Richard faced legal charges for his involvement in financial crimes, and it was clear he would spend the rest of his life fighting to stay out of prison. His public persona, once untouchable, was forever tarnished, and his name became synonymous with greed and betrayal. The high society he once dominated now rejected him completely. His legacy, once his greatest source of pride, was destroyed, leaving him with nothing but the wreckage of his former life. For Laura, Emily, and Ethan, the moment of Richard's downfall brought a sense of vindication, but it wasn't as sweet as they had imagined. They had spent years driven by the need for revenge, the desire to see the man who had torn their family apart face justice. But standing on the other side of their victory, they realized that revenge wasn't what defined them. They had rebuilt their lives, found success, and discovered their own strength in the process. Richard's fall was the final chapter in a story that no longer controlled them, As the dust settled, they made a collective decision. There would be no further exploitation of Richard's downfall. They had won the battle, but they refused to become consumed by it. Laura, in particular, felt the weight of that choice. She had spent so many years focused on bringing Richard down that she had almost forgotten what it meant to live without that burden. Now, with the past behind them, she was determined to move forward, to live a life defined by more than just revenge. Emily and Ethan felt the same. They had built their own successful careers, driven in part by the need to prove themselves, to escape the shadow of their family's past. But now, with Richard out of their lives, they could focus on the future. For Emily, that meant continuing her work in law, fighting for justice in ways that went beyond personal vendettas. For Ethan, it meant expanding his financial ventures, using his skills to build something lasting and meaningful. As a family, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The years of struggle, pain, and sacrifice had shaped them into who they were now, stronger, wiser, and more resilient. They had faced the worst and come out the other side, not just as survivors, but as individuals who had found their own paths. In the quiet moments that followed the chaos of Richard's downfall, they found a sense of peace. They had confronted the man who had once held so much power over them, and in doing so, they had freed themselves from the past. The need for revenge had been replaced by something far more valuable: freedom, and the knowledge that they had taken control of their own lives. In the months that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Laura's business continued to thrive, her reputation as a successful entrepreneur growing. Emily became a respected lawyer, known for her integrity and tenacity, while Ethan's financial acumen earned him a seat at the table with some of the most influential people in the business world. They had built something for themselves, independent of Richard, and it felt good to live without the weight of their past hanging over them. The family had come full circle, but in a way none of them had expected. What started as a quest for revenge had turned into a journey of self-discovery, healing, and growth. They had faced their darkest moments and emerged on the other side, not just as the victors of their battle with Richard, but as individuals who had found their own strength, purpose, and peace. The epilogue of their story was not one of bitterness or lingering anger, but of contentment. They had learned that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, was not what ultimately defined their happiness. It was the journey, the resilience, and the bonds they had strengthened along the way that mattered. Laura, Emily, and Ethan had found their way back to one another, and in doing so, they had created a new legacy, one built on love, perseverance, and the power to overcome. In the end, their story was one of transformation. What began as a fight for justice had become a testament to their ability to rise above the past and carve out a future on their own terms. They were no longer defined by Richard Carlyle's cruelty, but by their own strength and the life they had built together.